Welcome in, book lovers. This is Chris Storm Books, and we are in conversation with everyone in the book world. We're looking for the buzz, the trends, the stories behind the stories, and even a few secrets. Let's get started. You're going to be very excited about who we have with us here today. For all of you loyal listeners from 2 years ago, we had Samantha Greene Woodruff when she came out with her first debut novel, The Lobotomist's Wife, got all kinds of crazy awards, #1 Amazon bestseller, first reads pick. Her writing has appeared in all sorts of locations with accolades and endorsements. We've been patiently waiting for the next book, and here it is, The Trade-Off, for our YouTube watchers. Sam, welcome back to Bookstorm. We're very excited about this book.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be a repeat podcast guest, YouTube, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Well, I want to tell our listeners a little bit about you because I really love your bio. It's very personal. It's professional mixed with personal. It sheds a little bit of light onto who you are. You spent most of your career telling stories to executives at MTV Networks as the Senior VP of Strategy and Business Development. That's pretty cool. We all love MTV. Subsequently, you did audience research for Viacom's Nickelodeon Group, another place that we all go to and love. Now, here's what we're happy about. You left corporate life to become a full-time mom. You spent your newfound free time teaching yoga, becoming a dog lover, writing a humor column, and taking classes in fiction writing at St. Lawrence College. We're so happy that you did. We think you found your true gift and passion here. We're super excited to talk to you about The Trade-Off. And I just want to tell our listeners that Samantha lives in Southern Connecticut with her husband, 2 children, 2 dogs, a small reptile zoo. That's curious. And when she's not with her family at her laptop, she's still doing yoga. She is at a concert singing Taylor Swift, fellow Swiftie right here, and taking long walks with a friend. I love that about you. Welcome back to Bookstorm.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Sam, as you may remember, we love to give our listeners just a little bit of the background of what's going on in your story. I promise not to give away any spoilers, and it's a little hard to do, so I'm going to be very careful with this one. So we're talking about The Trade-Off, and this story takes us right back to 1920s New York City, and we meet Bea Abramovitz. She is a woman who is living in an East Side tenement. Her family is trying to recover. They have basically fled the pogroms in Russia, and they're trying to get back on their feet. And she's really gifted in terms of numbers and math. And it's an ability that her father is always, helping her along and challenging her. And one of the games that they play is they love to predict stocks and really start to look at those financial numbers. So she decides that that's something that she really would love to go into as she is going to school. And there's not a lot of opportunities, of course, for women at this point. Now, her brother, who has a lot of charm, does not necessarily have her giftedness. And they get to a point where he might have the opportunity to be a stockbroker, but she has the brains. And so they team up because there's a lot going on across the nation and even in the world financially. And those financial markets are going gangbusters. She's got some uncomfortable feelings about what might be coming next. And she decides it's time for her to step up and take a little more control. And it really changes the lives of a lot of people. I don't want to say anything else without maybe you bringing it up because, again, I don't want to give away those spoilers. But did you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I think that it's not a spoiler to say that the stock market rose precipitously and then crashed tremendously, leading us into the Great Depression. And the crash and the impending depression very much looms large over the story, particularly as the story goes on. And B is because of her abilities to recognize patterns and numbers and look at things from a different angle, she sees the crash coming and no one really believes her when she predicts it. So I think that we could add that.
Yeah, we all knew that was looming because that was
Yes,
a huge
exactly.
point in American history. And so I want to talk about a couple of prejudices that I saw in this book that really touched the reader's heart. The first one, as we know in the 1920s, was against women. Women
Mhm.
had the right to vote at that time, I believe, but
Yep.
they were still like the weaker, less intelligent species. This is one of my pet peeves. When women don't support women, still happens today, even though I think we still are a marginalized community today. Even Bee's mother had low expectations of her, despite Bee's mother's own troubled childhood. But Bea's mother was more concerned with what society thought of her daughter than her own daughter's hopes and dreams. And I had to ask you, does something like that in Bea's life, a parent in particular, her mother, would that even make Bee begin to question her own aptitude?
So I think that you guys have read The Lobotomist's Wife, and for readers who haven't, the protagonist is also a strong woman who's trying to make her way in a man's world. I like to write about that. I like to write about strong women who are in some way or another before their time. I think that for B, people's doubting her, particularly her mother's, didn't really rattle her that much because that was the setup of her entire life. Her mother in many ways was very traditional. She came from Russia and had been aristocratically wealthy, lost everything when they came to America in the early 1900s, and never adapted to tenement life the same way that many other immigrants did, because she never had to do any of the things that she now was expected to do in the tenements when she was at home. And so from the time that B was basically able to walk and talk, her mother relied on her to do all the classic female things in the household. And even those she didn't really praise B for. So I believe that B grew up in an environment where her father had some faith in her and her brother had some faith in her, but her mother never overtly gave her praise, because, we come to find out more about how and why later. But I think that was the framework that B operated in. So for her, that was the baseline. And from there, she said, well, you're wrong, and was able to keep going. And I think she did that a lot. She definitely hit moments through the story. And I think because she's a human being, right? I mean, she's a fictional character, but I wanted her to be as human and dimensional as possible. She helped certainly hit moments of self-doubt and definitely believed that she wasn't capable of the things that she hoped she would be capable of. But I think, of course, the seed of that is planted by your parents if you believe in psychology at all. And my mother is a psychotherapist, and so I grew up with therapy as a religion, basically. So I do believe that. But I think her mother's doubts also gave her more strength to fight in some ways.
And we love stories about women in jeopardy and women empowerment, both from history and today. And I was going to follow up and say, maybe sometimes all of this disparagement and criticism lights a little fire in us like it did for B.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah.
I think too, one thing that was very interesting for me in doing the research for this book, when I knew I wanted to write a book about the era, and there's a variety of reasons, which I talk about in my author's note from Contemporary Stock Market. And I decided that I wanted the protagonist to be a female who wants to be a stockbroker. I actually assumed that because the 1920s was flappers and speakeasies and smoking and sex, and that it was very free, and the suffragists had just earned women the right to vote. In many ways, it was this like liberal bubble for women in history. And so I was surprised when B encountered that first prejudice. I wrote it in, but when in my research, I discovered that while so much of the world, so much of America was more open to women doing new things, or women were blazing trails, whether people liked it or not, Wall Street was not that way. Decidedly not that way. And so that gave B kind of her first strike in her journey, her first impediment to success, really. Sorry, that was probably a tangent.
We love it. Fascinating.
Yeah.
In fact, I'd like to dive a little deeper into something that you and Chris were just talking about a second ago, and that is some of these family dynamics. Now, in this story, we've got a complicated relationship between Bee and her brother Jake, and it's made more complicated by what you alluded to, and that is the mother thinking he is the golden child. And at one point, Bee brings up something that potentially he did not do right or well, or maybe there's an ethical challenge there. And the mother had a lot of resentment. I wanted to ask you about that mother wound because, here I was wondering if you thought it reflected something more about the mother than it did anything about B. And do you think B understood that?
I don't think B completely understood that. I think that B understood that in the context of her family relationship. And I think it's not giving too much away for the reader to say that one of the things that I cover in the novel, it's not just about Wall Street, but it really is about the 20s and the excess of the 20s. And there were a lot of Ponzi schemes going on around the country, one of which was one that I discovered that I'd never heard of called the Julian Petroleum Oil Scheme. And B's brother goes off to California and gets involved in the Julian Petroleum Oil Scheme where they're selling shares of fake oil mines. Basically, it's a pyramid scheme of where they're selling shares of fake oil mines. And B tries to explain that this might be happening to her parents, and her parents say, "How dare you think that this could be happening? Your son, my son." Her mother says, "My son would never get involved in something that wasn't on the up and up." But I think that B always was, while it was definitely her mother's impediment, some of it is also the time period. I think, particularly in a Jewish family, and they were Jewish, it was very traditional for the woman to be in the home and taking care of things within the domestic realm. B was fortunate because her father was a little bit more modern thinking. But B's mother relied on her because she needed B to do the things that she couldn't do for herself. And that was sort of part of what created this dynamic where B's twin brother was such the golden boy, because he was the man who could go out and do things. And he happened to be very charming and, very good at getting things that he wanted without working too hard for them. Yeah. And I think that B resented that to a degree, but also understood it. She knew that those were the rules within which she would have to operate to a certain degree. And I think, of course, there is a part of her that wanted it to be different. And as things go along in her story, she gets stronger and stronger at pushing back against some of those constraints. But I do think she understood their whole family dynamic was that everybody in the family was sort of circling around the mother like she was the son to protect her because she was so destroyed by all that had been lost when they fled to America. So everybody's had a role in sort of keeping her happy and propped up. And B knew that. And she kind of assumed her role, even if she didn't love it.
Yeah, all those dynamics were so fascinating in the story. And I think readers will love watching how B deals with that. She's processing a lot of resentment. I mean, can you imagine as a sister seeing your brother get all this undeserved attention and accolades and money and whatever, came along with what he was doing? And I loved seeing her journey. It was the most beautiful part of this book.
Thank you. I mean, I think her journey to find and the way that she slowly finds herself was probably is really what the story is about, and the way that she finds her place in her family and with her, through the help of her friends. Like, it was very important for me to have this group of friends. She has a group of female friends who they all really support each other, like another family. And I think that all of those pieces help move her along slowly to find her way and find her voice.
And she found a way to use her intelligence despite the prejudices. She worked a way in, even maybe without the notoriety. And there was something very admirable about that. The other prejudice I wanted to talk about that came out in this book that really hurt the reader's heart, really touched our heart, was the prejudice against nationalities and religions. Okay, so we know that B and her family fled Russia because of growing anti-Semitism at that time. You reminded the reader how dangerous it is to place labels and stereotypes on any group of people. It's ignorant and it's dangerous. I like when B said this. I wanted to be seen for my brain, not my gender or my background. Wow. So do we all. And it still goes on today. What
Right.
was it possible for B and any of us today to be stripped away from all of those stereotypes and just to be seen for who we are? Are we still fighting?
We're definitely still fighting. I mean, I think, when I wrote this novel, I first of all did not set out to write a book about anti-Semitism, which I do think B's Judaism became very central to the story, in my mind at least. But I wrote this novel before October 7th and before we saw all of the major increases in anti-Semitism. I was kind of already through the lion's share of my drafting and editing by the time all of that happened. And it became twice as important to me that that thread was in the story, because you do see B both just as a human being and as a person who has a lot of success, but doesn't get recognized for the success in the same way because of who she is. And that she exists as B, but then there's still all of these social signifiers. She's female, she's poor, she's Jewish, that she has to fight against. And that was important for me to highlight in the story, because I don't think we've gotten that far. And if you want to keep it less broad and macro political and just talk about financial services world, in finance in the 1920s, there were almost no roles for women. And the only women that did have roles were wealthy socialites who went to Seven Sister schools, who had probably, could trace their lineage back to the Mayflower, who were connected. And they got jobs at these banks because they had been clients of the banks, and they had done all sorts of fundraising and things during the war effort in World War I. And the banks kind of saw an opportunity as the market was becoming a little bit more egalitarian, and more women, mostly rich women who had allowances, were investing as a means to play with their money and make more. The banks wanted women like those women to serve those women. So you had these women's departments come up, but they were wealthy socialite women who were canvassing other wealthy socialite women and serving other wealthy socialite women. So if you were a woman on Wall Street in the 1920s and you didn't have connections and you didn't have money, there was no use for you except in the back office. There was no, you could push papers around, you could answer phones, but there was no use for you beyond that. And that was a hard lesson for B to learn, because it was one that shocked me when I learned it in my research. And so that became, again, a key piece of the story, is this struggle that some of these external factors that have nothing to do with our skills or our abilities or what we can bring to the table will become limiting factors for what we can do in life. And it's really sad. And it's still true in finance to a large degree.
I bet so. And I'll tell you, so this book was very timely, although you didn't anticipate that when you were writing it. It has just come out. And I'm telling you, it's important for all Jewish people, but really for all of us, to see how quickly the tide can turn and danger can rise up. So also what was about looming in your book, not only the major stock market crash, but World War II was coming. So
Yes.
there was a lot, you sort of showed that things were boiling in a bad direction, and what was B going to do with it. You made it a personal level. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, as I said, so the reason that B was Jewish is because I wanted to write a story about an investor on Wall Street who wasn't sort of the archetypal evil Wall Street villain. And to do that, I wanted a backstory that would justify a reason for wanting to work in a world of extreme wealth and money. And I looked to my own family history. And my great-grandmother, Kate, fled pogroms and came to this country and had been really wealthy and lost everything and apparently never recovered. And my grandmother was sort of treated as her servant. She was the only daughter in her family, and she was treated as her mother's servant. And she, my grandmother as well, grew up a depression baby and then always had this preoccupation with wealth and things. Like on the one hand, she and my grandfather were ideologically communist, but like I have a Cartier pin that she bought that was her prized possession. You know, like there was that real sort of back and forth conflict with wealth. And so when I looked to my family history, I said, "Oh, this is perfect. This is a real way that one might have a preoccupation with wealth and a desire to make money that isn't just motivated by what people assume the market is, which is greed."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then as I learned what it was like to be a Jewish woman at that time, especially on Wall Street, where a lot of the banks were run by Jewish men. I mean, a lot of the banks were founded by Jewish men, but there was also a hierarchy among the Jews. Those were German Jews who had come over a generation before, and they were men. So it became more and more important to highlight all of those prejudices because I was surprised by them. And if I'm surprised by them doing my research, I figure the reader's going to be surprised by them. And those are the kinds of things, especially as a writer of historical fiction, that you really want to give to your readers. Things that you wouldn't expect about the time and place that teach you something. And, you know, as you said, Chris, I think it's very true. It's a real cautionary tale for where our world is going today, and one that I hope people pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to give one quick little plug to Zibby Owen's book that you have a chapter in called On Being Jewish Now. I think it's fantastic. Little side plug for that since you're one of the authors in there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
You know, Sam, as you were talking, I couldn't help but think about when the Jews during Moses's time fled Egypt, what could they take with them? And that was maybe, you know, jewelry or gold or silver. And so there were so many analogies as you were speaking back to the entire history of the Jewish people. So, yeah. Related to that, there's another theme about risk in your book. And I thought this was really, really well done. For example, B always went back to her core values when she was assessing risk and some of her next moves, the next things coming down the pipe. And she had a couple foundational principles like what goes up must come down, or some things are too good to be true. Now, many people get caught up in the excitement of something, especially when there's money involved, and they abandon some of those very important guidelines. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, for B, when more risk was on the line, her principles became more important.
That's an interesting observation. I think for B, she was never at her motivations for doing what she was doing. And without giving anything away, there were times when making money was more important and less important. But she was drawn to the job because of the puzzle of it, because of the skills it required, because she liked looking at patterns and data and making predictions based on what she saw. And so risk shouldn't come to bear in those moments, right? The rules that if that's why you're doing your investing or any decision you're making in your life, it's very easy to stay within your rules. And I think for B, that's where she was comfortable. She faltered a little bit when she had to get outside of those rules and when the stakes were higher and when she actually needed to make money in some way or another. And I think didn't always remember those rules. I think that, you know, that, and the other thing about that beyond B is that was the prevailing sentiment of the 1920s, which I find so fascinating, that this idea that what goes up must come down was completely forgotten and like theoretically disproven until it was dramatically proven in a way that set the country back, you know, tremendously. Yeah. But I think for B, that also gave her rules and her principles gave her comfort. That was how she stayed grounded to who she was most of the time. And occasionally she lost her path. The fact that you bring up that one line, what goes up must come down, I just have to tell you guys as an aside, I wanted to call this book What Goes Up. Because I think the whole point, like to me, that like it foreshadowed the crash, but it got killed. It apparently too rom-com sounding.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Trade-off is great.
That was the core.
The trade-off title is fantastic. You couldn't go wrong with that.
It definitely works. And I think there is another theme in the book of, particularly for women, that we are always making a trade-off. I mean, even today, there is always a trade-off. There's always something you have to give up to get something else. And some of that is life and growing up and being human, but I think it's even more true for women. I think women have to make more sacrifices in order to gain other things. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you for that very thoughtful response. We love talking to you about your stories. They are so deep and there's so many cool themes that you explore. Beautifully done. Can you give us a little clue of what you're working on next?
This is so hard because I'm working on two very different things and I haven't landed on what I'm going to stay with. I think I'm going to pivot, and I don't know if you guys know this, but I live in Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a crazy, Tony, top, like, lifestyles of the rich and famous kind of town. And I've been here for a long time, and this is not how I grew up. And so I very much have always felt a little bit like a fish out of water observer of, and I started here, like, we moved here, and I've started creating a social life and establishing myself when my daughter was less than 1 year old. So I went through all the preschool stuff and the mom stuff. And so I've always thought it would be really fun to do some kind of social satire about Greenwich, sort of how Ellen Hildebrand writes about Nantucket, although hers is, mine probably will be somewhat of a love story too. But so I've started working on, it's part social satire and part domestic thriller suspense that takes place in Greenwich.
Excellent.
Yes. So that's where I'm putting my efforts right now. I also have a historical novel that I had started before that will see the light of day someday. That is about, it's a dual timeline that takes place in almost present day, a few years earlier than now, and in the 1980s in Romania under the dictatorial Ceausescu's. So you can see where one is a little more light and fun and the other one's a little heavier.
Oh, we can't wait. Absolutely. Well, and we always love talking to you. So we hope you come back when those next books come out.
You guys are the best. You have the best questions. Always.
Oh, good. Thank you. And I'm going to tell our listeners how to connect with you. You are on Facebook, on X, on Instagram. They can go to your website at samanthawoodruff.com. And again, we just want to thank you. This was such a really awesome book, entertaining, thoughtful, and we enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Great to see you guys again.
Kristen, there's one question we should have asked that we didn't ask because B was so great at stocks. She had like a sixth sense. What stock would B buy today? Got any tips, Sam?
I know, because not only am I terrible at stocks, but I'm so disinterested. That was like the hardest part for me, was that research.
I saw that in one of your author notes.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
You can't
ask my husband that question. He helped me understand what the heck was going on with all the market stuff.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Take care, Sam.
All right. Bye. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.